Imagine being just 10 years old, trapped in an elevator with a newborn in your arms, completely alone. No way to call for help. The clock is ticking, and your heart races as the situation becomes more dire by the second. The elevator doors slammed shut with a quiet thud, sealing Malik inside. Before he could even process what was happening, the floor beneath him jolted violently, sending a tremor through his small frame. The lights flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows against the steel walls. His stomach tightened as he pressed the button for his floor, then the lobby, then any button he could reach. Nothing happened. The elevator remained still. Then a sound broke through the silence, a soft, delicate whimper. Malik looked down at the newborn in his arms, her tiny face scrunched up, her lips trembling as she let out another weak cry. She was wrapped snugly in a light pink blanket, her head barely peeking out. His grip on her instinctively tightened. His heart pounded, not because he was scared for himself, but because of her. He had only stepped into the elevator to return home after running a small errand for his mother. Just before the doors had closed, he noticed the baby lying alone in a stroller, abandoned for reasons he couldn't understand. Without thinking, he had scooped her up, his instincts taking over before logic could. He hadn't even had time to call for help before the doors shut and the elevator malfunctioned. Now, here he was, trapped in a metal box between floors, holding a baby who couldn't even tell him what she needed. He tried the emergency button. No response. He knocked on the metal doors, his voice shaking. "Hello, can anybody hear me? We're stuck." His voice echoed, but there was nothing on the other side. Just silence. His throat felt dry. How long would they be in here? Did anyone even know they were inside? The baby let out another cry, slightly louder this time. Malik bounced slightly on his heels, rocking her gently the way he had seen mothers do in the neighborhood. "Shh, it's okay," he whispered. He wasn't sure if he was saying it for her or himself. He glanced around, searching for something, anything that could help. The walls were smooth, offering no gaps. The control panel was unresponsive. The only thing he had in here was his own wits and the fragile life resting in his arms. He pressed his ear against the elevator doors, listening for any signs of movement. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices. He knocked again, harder this time, his voice more desperate. "Please, there's a baby in here. Someone help." Still nothing. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, making it harder to breathe. His arms were starting to ache from holding the baby so tightly, but he didn't dare loosen his grip. She was so small, so helpless. What if she was hungry? What if she needed something? Malik took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment. Panicking wouldn't help. He had to think. His mother always told him that in an emergency, the most important thing was to stay calm. He looked down at the baby, who was now sucking on her tiny fingers. She wasn't crying as much now, but her small whimpers sent waves of anxiety through him. He tried to remember everything he knew about taking care of babies. His neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, had a newborn, and he had seen her feed and rock her baby countless times. The thought of her gave him hope. She would know what to do if he could just get out of here. He shifted his weight, trying to keep himself steady. The elevator was eerily quiet except for the faint hum of machinery, reminding him that they were suspended between floors. He wondered if the power had gone out in the building, or if someone was already working to fix the issue. He took another deep breath. "It's okay," he whispered again, this time more to reassure himself. "Someone's gonna come." The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. His legs started to cramp from standing in the same position, but he refused to sit down. He had to stay ready, had to stay alert. Then, finally, he heard something, a faint voice. His heart leapt as he pressed himself against the doors, straining to hear. Is someone in there? His entire body sagged with relief. Yes, I'm here. There's a baby with me. We're stuck. There was a brief pause. Then the voice returned, louder this time. Okay, kid, just stay calm. We're working on it. Malik exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. They were going to be okay. The baby stirred against his chest, her tiny fingers gripping onto the fabric of his shirt. Malik looked down at her, his heart swelling with something unfamiliar. He had been terrified, but he had kept her safe. He had done everything he could. And in that moment, as he stood in the dimly lit elevator waiting for rescue, he realized something. Maybe being brave wasn't about not being scared. Maybe it was about stepping up, even when fear tried to take over. And for the first time, he believed that he could handle whatever came next. Malik had grown up learning how to survive. His world was one where you had to be tough, where kindness was often mistaken for weakness. Raised in a low-income neighborhood, he had seen his mother work tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings, often skipping meals so they could eat. He had learned early on that life didn't give second chances, and the world didn't always care about kids like him. But Malik was different. Despite the hardships, he carried a heart full of compassion, always looking out for those who had no one else to rely on. At just 10 years old, he had already seen the way people looked at him when he walked into a store or passed by wealthier families in the city. They clutched their belongings a little tighter, avoided eye contact, or crossed the street entirely. It didn't matter that he was just a kid. His skin color and where he came from made people assume things about him. But he had never let it get to him. His mother always told him that real strength wasn't about proving people wrong with words, but with actions. That afternoon had been like any other. Malik had been sent on an errand by his mother, weaving through the crowded city streets, dodging people too busy with their own lives to notice him. The high-rise building where he was now trapped was one he had never entered before. A place where wealthy families lived far removed from the struggles he knew. He had only come inside because of the heavy rain that had started to pour. He figured he'd wait in the lobby for the worst of the storm to pass before heading home. He hadn't expected to find a baby, alone, abandoned in an empty stroller inside the elevator. The moment he saw her, something inside him told him to act. He didn't know where her parents were or why she was left there, but she was too small to be alone. Without thinking, he had picked her up, cradling her the way he had seen mothers in his neighborhood do with their own children. Then, as if fate had been waiting for him to step inside, the elevator doors had slammed shut. The floor beneath him jolted, and the lights flickered before the entire space went still. Now, standing in the dim, silent elevator, holding the newborn in his arms, Malik felt the weight of the situation settle in his chest. The baby was a stranger to him, a child of privilege from a world that had always seemed distant from his own. Yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. She wasn't a symbol of wealth or status. She was just a helpless infant, innocent and unaware of the danger surrounding them. The city outside the high-rise continued as usual, completely oblivious to the fact that two lives were now trapped, waiting for someone to notice. The people in this building were too accustomed to their routines, too busy to pay attention to a broken elevator or the fate of a young boy and a child inside it. Malik had seen it before, how the wealthy moved past problems that didn't directly affect them, assuming Someone else would take care of it. He tightened his grip around the baby, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest. Her tiny fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt as she let out a small whimper. He gently rocked her, whispering, "It's okay. I got you." The elevator remained still, and for the first time, Malik felt the weight of the responsibility he had unknowingly taken on. He had saved her from being alone, but now he had to keep her safe in a situation where no one else even knew they were trapped. He thought of his mother and what she would tell him to do. Stay calm. Think. Don't let fear take over. Malik pressed his ear against the metal doors, listening for any sound, any sign that someone outside knew they were in here. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the city beyond, the world moving on without them. He glanced down at the baby, wondering what kind of life she would have once they got out of here. She would grow up never knowing this moment, never remembering that a stranger had held on to her, kept her safe. But Malik would remember. He didn't know what was going to happen next. But one thing was certain. He wasn't just a scared kid stuck in an elevator anymore. He was her protector. And no matter what, he wasn't going to let her down. The moment the elevator jolted to a stop, Malik's body tensed. His grip instinctively tightened around the newborn, holding her close as if that alone could shield her from the sudden, terrifying stillness that surrounded them. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it over the soft hum of the elevator's failing motor. The baby let out a small whimper at first. Then, as if sensing the unease in the air, her cries grew louder, her tiny body trembling against him. Malik's breath came in short bursts. He had never been in a situation like this before, never been responsible for another life. It wasn't just himself he had to think about now. This baby, small and helpless, depended on him. He tried to push down the fear creeping up his spine as he stepped forward, banging his fist against the cold metal doors. "Help! Somebody help us!" His voice echoed in the small space, bouncing off the walls before fading into silence. He knocked harder, pressing his ear against the door, hoping to hear footsteps or voices on the other side. Nothing. He swallowed hard, shifting his stance as he tried again. "Please, there's a baby in here. We need help." Still nothing. The only sound filling the elevator was the baby's cries, raw and piercing. Malik took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help. He looked down at the newborn, her face scrunched up, her tiny fists flailing against his chest. He knew she didn't understand what was happening, only that something wasn't right. He rocked her gently, whispering, "Shh, it's okay. We're okay." His voice wavered, but he kept going. "Somebody's gonna find us." The baby's cries softened slightly, but she still whimpered, her small body wriggling uncomfortably in his arms. Malik adjusted his hold, tucking the blanket around her more securely. His own hands were shaking now, but he couldn't let her feel that. She needed to feel safe, even if he didn't. Sweat formed at his temples as he turned to the control panel, his fingers hovering over the buttons. He pressed them again, each floor, the open door button, even the emergency stop. Nothing. The small red emergency light blinked at him, taunting him with its uselessness. Come on," he muttered under his breath, pressing again, harder this time. His fingers were slick with sweat. Nothing worked. His pulse quickened. The walls around him felt smaller now, the air heavier. Time was slipping away, and he had no idea how long they'd been trapped. 5 minutes? 10? More? It felt like hours. He stepped back, pressing his back against the wall, trying to keep himself steady. The baby had stopped crying as much, but she still squirmed restlessly in his arms. He knew she was probably hungry. Or scared? Maybe both. He had to figure something out. His mind raced through the possibilities. The elevator was old, he could tell from the worn buttons and the faded emergency labels. Maybe it had just shut down on its own, and someone would fix it soon. Or maybe it was worse than that. Malik's stomach tightened at the thought. What if no one even knew they were in here? He turned his head up toward the ceiling. Some elevators had emergency exits, right? He had seen it in movies before, where people climbed out and got to safety. But when he scanned the roof, he saw no opening. Just a flat, cold surface that offered no escape. He exhaled sharply, frustration creeping into his chest. He had to stay focused. There had to be a way to get someone's attention. He tried banging on the doors again, harder this time. "Help! There's a baby in here." His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't care. He just needed someone, anyone, to hear. Nothing. The longer he stood there, the heavier the weight of responsibility became. He was just a kid, a 10-year-old who should have been home by now. He never expected to be here in this moment, forced to figure out how to protect a baby that wasn't even his. But here he was, and he wasn't going to give up. The baby shifted against his chest, her tiny fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt. Malik looked down at her, his heart aching. She was so small, so fragile, and yet in that moment, she was everything. She was the reason he had to keep trying. He adjusted his hold, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, like he had seen his mother do with his younger siblings. "I got you," he whispered. "I'm not gonna let anything happen to you." Minutes passed, stretching longer with each breath. His muscles ached, but he refused to put her down. He had to be ready the moment help arrived. If help arrived. His mind wandered for just a second, wondering what other people would do in this situation. Would they panic? Would they break down? Or would they, like him, refuse to let fear take control? If you were in his shoes, what would you have done? Would you have been able to stay calm, to think through the fear? How would you handle the weight of another life in your hands? Malik didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore, and that meant failure wasn't an option. A faint hum vibrated through the elevator walls. Malik froze, barely daring to breathe as the low mechanical sound grew louder. Was it real, or was his mind playing tricks on him? He pressed his ear against the cold metal, straining to hear. Then, suddenly, movement. The elevator shuddered. His heart leapt to his throat as a jolt ran through the floor beneath him. A second later, a loud clank echoed above, followed by the unmistakable creak of the doors unlocking. A sliver of light cut through the dim space, growing wider as the doors slid open. Malik squinted as brightness flooded in. A rush of cool air hit his face, a stark contrast to the heavy, stale warmth that had built inside the elevator. Blinking against the sudden glare, he made out the blurry shapes of people standing in front of him. Then a voice, calm and firm. "Kid, are you all right?" His gaze snapped up. A paramedic, dressed in navy blue with a reflective vest, crouched down, eyes scanning Malik for injuries. The man's expression shifted when he saw what was cradled in Malik's arms. "The baby," the paramedic said softly, reaching out. "Let me take her." Malik hesitated for just a moment, his arms instinctively tightening around the newborn. He had held her for what felt like forever, protected her in a space where no one else could. Now, letting go felt strangely difficult, but he knew this was the right thing. Slowly, he loosened his grip, allowing the paramedic to carefully lift the baby from his arms. The newborn let out a tiny whimper as she was placed into the safety of strong, steady hands. Malik's arms felt suddenly empty, the absence of her small weight leaving a strange hollowness in his chest. He exhaled shakily. It was over. As the paramedic checked the baby, Malik finally stepped forward. The moment he crossed the threshold into the lobby, a wave of noise hit him. Gasps, murmurs, hushed whispers rippling through the crowd that had gathered. People stood frozen in place, their eyes locked on him. Their faces, a mix of shock and awe, reflected the realization of what had just happened. The young boy they had barely noticed before had just saved a life. Malik swallowed, shifting on his feet as the attention bore down on him. He hadn't even realized there were this many people in the lobby. Some were residents of the building, dressed in crisp suits and expensive coats. Others were staff members, doormen, security guards, and janitors who had likely been working when the commotion started. They all stared at him in stunned silence. He wasn't sure what to do. A woman near the front of the crowd covered her mouth with her hands, shaking her head in disbelief. A man whispered something to the person beside him, his brows furrowed in thought. Even the security guard, who had probably seen 1,000 emergencies before, looked at Malik with an expression that was hard to place. Then someone clapped. Just once. A single, deliberate sound. And then another. The sound grew, building like rolling thunder, until the entire lobby was filled with applause. Malik's stomach twisted. This wasn't why he did it. He hadn't stepped into the elevator for attention. He hadn't cradled that baby, whispering reassurances into the silence, for recognition. He had done it because she needed someone. Because no one else had been there. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, a strange mix of pride and discomfort settling in his chest. He didn't know how to react. What was he supposed to do now? A woman stepped forward, a mother, judging by the way her eyes lingered on the baby now safely in the paramedic's arms. "You saved her," she said, voice barely above a whisper. That was incredible. Malik shuffled his feet, unsure of what to say. He hesitated, then shrugged. "I just did what anybody would have done." The words felt awkward on his tongue, but they were the only thing that made sense. A man in the crowd shook his head. "No, son, not anybody would have done that." More murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Malik's fingers curled into fists at his sides. His heart was still hammering in his chest, but for a different reason now. This wasn't about him. It had never been about him. He glanced over at the paramedic who was now gently rocking the baby, checking her vitals. She was safe. That was what mattered. His job was done. Without another word, Malik turned to leave. He wasn't sure where he was going, maybe just somewhere quiet, away from the eyes still watching him. But before he could take another step, a voice called out behind him. "Wait!" He turned, surprised to see one of the wealthier residents of the building stepping forward. A woman, dressed in designer clothing, looked at him with something unreadable in her gaze. "What's your name?" she asked. Malik hesitated before answering. "Malik." The woman nodded. "Well, Malik, the world needs more people like you." A lump formed in his throat, but he didn't respond. He didn't know how to. The crowd continued to watch him, their expressions no longer just shock or admiration. There was something else now, something Malik had rarely seen directed at him. Respect. He took a deep breath, standing a little taller. He hadn't expected any of this, but one thing was clear. Today, in a moment of crisis, he had made a difference, and that, more than anything, was enough. Malik never saw himself as a hero. He didn't think about what he had done as something extraordinary. He had simply acted. The moment he had stepped into that elevator and seen the baby left alone, his instincts had taken over. There had been no hesitation, no second-guessing. He had done what he knew was right, even though he was just a child himself. As he walked out of the building that day, away from the stunned faces and the overwhelming attention, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed what happened. For so long, people had looked at him and seen only what they expected to see, a poor black boy from a struggling neighborhood, someone who didn't belong in their world. But today, they had seen something different. They had seen his courage. The paramedics had assured him that the baby was going to be fine. She had calmed down, her tiny hands gripping the finger of the man who now held her securely in his arms. Her parents would come looking for her soon, and when they did, they would never know the fear that had filled that elevator. They would never understand the weight Malik had carried in those long, quiet moments, whispering to her, keeping her safe. But that didn't matter to him. He hadn't done it for them. As the evening set in and the city lights flickered on, Malik found himself thinking about everything that had happened. He had always believed in doing the right thing, even when life had shown him how unfair people could be. He had faced prejudice before, been looked down on by those who thought they were better than him. And yet, when the time had come to act, none of that had mattered. Courage had no race, no social status. It was not determined by wealth, by upbringing, or by the assumptions people made about one another. Courage was in the choices a person made when no one else was watching. He wondered if the people in that building would think differently now. Would they remember today the next time they passed by someone like him without a second glance? Would they think twice before making judgments based on the color of someone's skin or the neighborhood they came from? He didn't know, but he hoped. Malik had never expected to make an impact, but as he replayed the events of the day, he realized how powerful even the smallest actions could be. He had saved a life. Not because he wanted praise, not because he wanted people to see him differently, but because it had been the right thing to do. And that was enough. As he reached his neighborhood, the familiar streets welcoming him back into his world, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't just the kid people ignored anymore. He was more than that. He had proven, even if only to himself, that bravery wasn't about who people thought you were. It was about what you did when it mattered most. His story wasn't one that would make headlines. By tomorrow, the world would move on. The baby's family would take her home. The building's residents would go back to their daily lives, and the elevator would be repaired as if nothing had ever happened. But for Malik, something had changed forever. His mother was waiting for him when he arrived home, worry etched into her face. "Where have you been?" she asked, pulling him into a tight hug. Malik hesitated for a moment before responding. "I just had to help someone." His mother pulled back, looking at him with curiosity, but he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She simply nodded, sensing that whatever had happened, it had been important. As he sat down for dinner that night, his mind drifted back to the baby, to the sound of the elevator finally opening, to the applause that had felt so unfamiliar. He didn't want recognition for what he had done, but he hoped, deep in his heart, that maybe, just maybe, he had changed the way someone in that building saw the world. Because at the end of the day, that was what truly mattered. What does this story teach us about the value of life, regardless of race? What would you have done in Malik's place? Do you think small actions can make a difference in the way people see one another? Let's keep this conversation going. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes it only takes one act of kindness to change everything.